All right, thank you, Mary. So what I'm seeing is that 68% of you are currently working in a communal living DV shelter. Awesome. And many of you have worked in one in the past. 32% of you who have worked in one love it. And 5% hated, and others, 63% mixed feelings. I think that's kind of a common feeling. And let's see what you might entertain. Apartment building, scattered site. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. That really helps me in terms of knowing who's present in the room and where you are as far as communal living shelter. I know it's a tough topic, and just in terms of sharing a little bit about myself, about 35 years ago, that's how long I've been doing this work, I walked into a communal living shelter in northeastern Kentucky in a very rural area as I started my beginning as a volunteer, and I had my infant child on my hip. And I promptly fell in love with everything that I saw and experienced in that particular environment. The training, the director pretty much just told me, Linda, go and talk to the women. And that's what I did. I huddled with them around the kitchen table, drinking coffee, listening to stories, kids playing with one another. That's why the very first slide up, well, it was the very first slide up, and let's go back there. It should show little people scribbling, and that doesn't seem to be coming to life, but just playing with the kids. And there was such a feeling of warmth, of collegiality, that it was, it's kind of hard to beat. I think of our history of shelters, and that is how we started. In so many ways, the communal living house that one survivor, one battered woman might have and want to share with others, trying to make that safe refuge. We kind of went from the small homes to the big houses to the even bigger facilities. And, along the way, I think we lost a lot as we were supersizing. And they stopped being so small and so intimate. And as they got funding resources, federal dollars invested into them, in Washington state dollars, regulations started coming about. We started professionalizing and kind of doing something differently with the structure from those beginnings of small, intimate, and a little bit more connecting. I don't know what your favorite part of shelter is or was, but I would invite you to think about what you love the best about it. What is it that, just makes you smile in the morning when you get up and go to work, or if you're on a night shift, what are the things that make your heart sing? And I would invite you to reflect on those for a moment, and please feel free to enter them into the chat box. And I would invite Jeff to kind of watch that chat box for me. And as you enter, I'd love to hear what some of those things are. This is the type of presentation that spends a lot of time reflecting of who we are, where we are, and how we identify ourselves within that battered women's movement. And now more into a broader, more expansive movement. So Jeff, anything coming up in the chat yet? Or are people still reflecting and thinking?
They might be reflecting and thinking, Linda. I'd be happy to, if you wouldn't mind Oh, there are some people coming through. The ability for survivors to connect with each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
the feel of community and support of the women for each other.
Mhm.
Thank you both for those ads.
Yeah, that connection really is one of the best parts of shelter. And of course, the whole structure in mind, thinking of breaking isolation, because so many survivors, part of the coercive control and the domestic violence is to isolate, to cut people off from friends and family, neighbors. So that connection of being with people who have experienced many of the same things that a survivor has. I loved support groups. I loved what I so frequently heard in support groups, and one woman turning to another and saying, "Were you married to my abuser? Your story sounds just like mine. They did all of the same things." And being able to hear that connection, being able to watch kids play. I think the kids really were my favorite part of watching those little people, so many of them feeling free and safe, often for the first time in a long time. Of course, there were conflicted concerns. Some missed their parent, their dad. Others just weren't quite sure if they liked this place. It was such a different place from their own home, even though we tried to make sure there were the teddy bears and the toys that were there. But watching a family arrive and making those connections and feeling safe were just incredibly precious times that I will never forget during my 6 years in Kentucky. I was in that program for those 6 years. I was a volunteer for 2, the volunteer coordinator for 2, and then I became the shelter director, and was able to open a second shelter that was even a smaller, sweeter communal living shelter in a small house. And this was way out in rural Kentucky, and definitely experienced the culture of people coming from very rural areas, and trying to connect and finding again that sense of there are other people who experience this. I don't feel so isolated. So I think those times can absolutely never be minimized or eliminated. They live, I think, in all of us who have worked in a communal living shelter. So as I was leaving Kentucky, our family, we moved back home for me, and I came to work in East King County in Bellevue, where that particular agency was opening a brand new shelter. So I had that opportunity to actually go house hunting again. I had done it for the second little shelter in Kentucky, but this time the house needed to be a little bit bigger for the population. And what we called it, what we were referring to it as, was a safe home when home isn't safe. And that was the publicity that went out to the community, what they were supporting. We all had our shelter stories, those of us who had worked in communal living shelter, and we all envisioned what this beautiful home could be like for survivors coming to it. After a few years, I opened a communal living, group home living, transitional housing program for survivors who also experienced challenges with substance abuse disorder and mental health issues. So we had the two side by side. We were able to work together in terms of issues of substance abuse as well as trauma. And in many ways, a lot of great things happen for the women and kids. And as I've already mentioned in terms of children, one of my favorite things, especially for the women who were on the transitional housing side, was that since they were in a clean and sober recovery place, they often got their kids back, kids that had been removed by the child welfare services. And having the parties when those children came back home to their mom was probably some of my best memories. So the memories are great. I'm going to pause just a moment and see if anyone else has thoughts, special highlights to think about and celebrate all of the wonderful things of communal living shelter.
Yeah,
And
Linda, there were a few more additions.
okay.
A little structure when everything is upturned.
Mm-hmm.
Easy 24-hour access to advocates. And the last edition was similar to how you ended, but watching the children feel safe, secure enough to act like children and not like little adults.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you. And please, those of you who are reflecting, and I know there have been times I often sniffle through this part because there are many wonderful memories. So out of those wonderful memories, where did I start thinking about other things? And I will admit, I started that even as I was shelter house shopping, because I saw a report that had been put out by our King County administrators who funded shelter, a research study that basically said for survivors from culturally specific populations, this model didn't work for them because it wasn't often sensitive, flexible enough to their particular culture. And so I looked at that and I thought, well, if this is a problem, why are we still doing this? But this was the direction we were going in. So yes, we went ahead. And as I looked at shelter from that point on, again, all of the lovely stories are still there, but the more inclusive we tried to be, because I felt it really had to be inclusive. There were shelters, DV shelters in the area and in our state that would very carefully screen out survivors who might lead in, or the sense on the phone was that they had mental health issues. There certainly was a screening out if there was any suggestions of substance abuse. And so I thought this isn't working for me, that we're screening people out, that we're kind of deciding who gets emergency shelter. And of course, our administrative codes pretty much said whoever was in the greatest amount of danger, whoever was fleeing, whoever needed it the most needed to get shelter. And so there were different things going on there. Many of the staff had worked at other shelters in the area, and there was sometimes a dismissiveness about shelter hopping. Some of them had been to other DV shelters, some had been to the housing homeless emergency shelters, and pretty much said, she's just homeless. She really doesn't need shelter, or our DV shelter. So the screening out and just all of the things that came with that screening out, I just really started having a hard time with. The more we started learning about what trauma-informed meant, I realized how hard it is to create a trauma-informed environment when you've got, for us, we could have 8 adult survivors along with their kids. Imagine 8 people all in crisis, all experiencing a wide variety of traumas, often impacting mental health in terms of the symptoms, and being triggered by one another. And of course, this could trigger staff too. You know, so many of our wonderful advocates come from lived experience and often have those trauma triggers. And even though, you know, all of the advocates who have experienced that certainly hit that point of breathing and knowing how to take care of themselves, the trauma is still there. And they really look to the organization to create a culture where they can do their work and do their work without their own emotional triggers. One of the things, another thing is that personal autonomy, that sacrifice for collective well-being. And that is a fancy way of saying shelter rules. You know, how do you have, again, 8 families live together in complete harmony. And they each have different ways of doing things, or each different ideas of what should be happening. And before long, you get layer upon layer of rules in terms of how to behave. How are they going to share food, or what are the protocols for getting their medications, or what are they doing in terms of childcare? So, the rules just start blossoming all over the place. And there was another DV program director that joked about a rule that sprang up in their shelter that said no peeing in the closet. So I thought, what on earth was the trigger or the instigator for the no peeing in the closet? Well, a little boy had done that, and somebody decided that was worthy of letting families know you've got to find the bathroom. So, you look at the rules, and so frequently when we think about rules, not just really basic ones, but the rules for getting along with each other and sharing a place to live, how hard it is to negotiate that and still feel like you're affirmed, still feel like you can thrive and survive. I often heard shelter advocates talk about feeling they're just the rule enforcer, that all they would try to do is make sure a chore got done by a certain time of the day. And as we started peeling back on rules, and my encouragement for advocates, because of course the thing you want to do is you want to be an advocate. You don't want to be enforcing rules or managing people's behavior. You want to do the work that you got into, that you love, the reasons why you felt this was something that could be a calling for you. So just thinking about how challenging that was and how frustrating. One of the things I did to eliminate some of that was to have somebody come in and clean, so that the chores just kind of got taken off the table of what needed to be managed. But, there's so many other things, dynamics. The isolation by an abuser, while you can certainly kind of think about how the community in shelter can break through that, there's also the problem with trying to keep both the confidentiality and privacy of housemates. And then so many of us had confidential locations, which we certainly did. So that's another whole method of confidentiality, just isolating, where a survivor couldn't tell their family where they were, where a friend couldn't come and pick them up for coffee, where whatever ties they still had, they could maintain them only up to a degree, but ultimately that personal tie of connection often was interrupted by the need for that location to be confidential, and the fact that they couldn't talk about who they were with. We really enforce that one, or encourage that the other people here have their privacy, and please don't gab about them with folks outside of the shelter. I don't care if it's your best friend. Parenting in a fishbowl. Certainly all of the little people were excited to be in shelter, excited to be safe, and often with other kids. Again, many of you who work in shelter know that sometimes just all hell breaks loose because they're having so much fun, and they've got people to play with. They feel a little safer to do that, and they also pick up pretty quickly that in shelter we had rules about corporal punishment. And so the idea that mom wasn't going to be spanking them, another whole method and a thought of I'm free, I can do whatever I want, even as we thought about other ways to try and provide structure and support for a parent who was trying to, just kind of figure out other consequences for a little person. I've already mentioned the challenge for people from different cultures and communities. And that was huge. Where we were in East King County was a pretty homogeneous white area when I landed there. Survivors of color came from other parts of the county, and we realized how difficult that was for everybody in terms of dynamics of where they came from in the different areas of King County. And as the whole dynamic of the county itself changed with Microsoft, there was a growing Asian population, there was a growing African American population, a growing South Asian population. And we had many, many Jewish women. There were a lot of Jewish synagogues and communities. And we found that it was hard for everybody to really agree on how they were living together, how they were keeping things clean, what they were eating. There was a cleanup usually on Saturdays, and the Orthodox Jewish observing woman could not do that because of her faith. And there was the little backbiting, the snarkiness, the frustrations. So that wasn't working really well. And then it's difficult for those with disabilities. We did have a ramp, but you know, when the ramp is outside the building, and when that ramp is icy in the wintertime, it's hard for a wheelchair or a walker or somebody who needs a cane or other support to maneuver up and down. The oldest shelter program in our area, and probably in Washington State, had 3 stories plus a basement. And it was not accessible at all for those with mobile disabilities. And one woman in particular that just made me so sad when we did a visit talking about universal design for shelters. And she was the one who volunteered to give us a tour. And she had a little guy. And the first floor, of course, was the common space, living room, kitchen, dining room. The second floor were the offices with a couple of bedrooms, and the third floor were most of the bedrooms. And she had trouble. She was quite overweight, very obese, and she had problems with her knees and mobilizing. She also had respiratory problems. So as we huffed and puffed up the stairs with her, I thought, oh my gosh, how many times is she climbing these stairs every day with this little guy in tow? How is that working for her? And she was so happy to be there. She was happy, she was safe, and couldn't say enough good things about staff. But I had that little yank in my heart. And then when it came to going downstairs where the children's area was, she couldn't go down those stairs. They were too narrow. So her little guy had to go with another parent, another mom. And she couldn't wash clothes because both the stairs and then the laundry facilities were in such a small place that she literally couldn't fit into it. So, you know, just that reminder of, much as we love our big old homes, it's hard to get them up to speed. I know that there are many who will build communal living spaces to code, and you know, they're new and beautiful, and just, you know, some of the challenges are still there. Okay. Whoops. Oh, sorry about that. I just jumped ahead, knocked everything out, and people are probably saying, what on earth just happened? There, that's where we're supposed to be now. So if any of you were dozing, I've heard that I have a very soothing voice that can put people to sleep. So if you were dozing, hopefully that just woke y'all up. So in the midst of all of this came COVID-19. And I don't know about how you all are handling or did handle COVID-19, but of course we hit the point, since Washington State was one of the first states, or the first state where there was a diagnosed case. We went into full-on panic mode, and our governor shut everything down with stay-at-home orders, and all of the word getting out about how easily that illness spreads in shared living spaces. Now, of course, that shouldn't be a surprise, Again, all of you who have worked in communal living shelter probably come home with everybody's colds and flus and assorted other things. I think some would come home with lice, and some of us got scabies. It was, everybody's sharing, and it's close quarters. So we know that illness does spread in shared living spaces, no matter how much you scrub and clean. And of course, COVID brought with it a higher level of just lethality. It was dangerous. So our programs didn't quite know what to do, even those who were not so focused on their shared living spaces. But we have many that were, and some completely closed down, at least for a while. Others really limited who was coming, and if they arrived in shelter or were in shelter, they couldn't leave, which is a little difficult. Staff probably were not at shelter. They might check in, they might early days leave food on the front porch, but COVID really impacted how shelter was being done. So at this point, I invite you to, again, think about your programs and what you did during COVID. And if there's a short way of putting some of that in the chat box, I'd love to hear that. How did advocates, shelter advocates, and residents manage COVID? What did you do? Jeff, I'm kind of sensing that people are either sleeping or they're reflecting so deeply, and it's a long thing to, or maybe it's just a bad memory that who on earth wants to revisit?
We have first response says split it between hotel stays and long-term stays.
Yeah.
Another participant shared the education about how it is spread. They asked residents to wear masks and establish trust with advocates to tell us if they had been exposed and the room for isolation.
Mm-hmm.
Another participant shared, we stopped operating a communal shelter and started using hotel motel instead and utilizing housing funding more to get folks into permanent housing.
You are well on the way.
Another participant shared, we continued to work. We separated folks as much as possible and then used hotels. Did a lot of cleaning and wearing a mask.
Yeah, and I think we're all so extremely excited to get past COVID. It's on the horizon. Before we leave this, I don't want to be too horribly negative about communal living shelter, though I think everybody knows my journey and about my position at this point related to that. But are there any other things about communal living shelter that were not positive, that you would be happy to get rid of, that I didn't cover already? Got it all? Okay. I won't belabor it. But with us early on, shortly after I started at the Washington State Coalition, one of my coworkers who had been working on shelter rules, Margaret Hobart, just knew that so many people love their communal living buildings, or even if they didn't love them, they were the buildings they had. And that's what they had to make work for emergency shelter. And so what she started doing was digging into how can you make that communal living shelter more positive, more affirming, And what she did was she did focus groups all around the state, and she gave the women in the programs cameras, and she asked them to take pictures of what she loved about shelter and what they hated about shelter, and to send them to her. So she used those pictures and their comments and feedback to develop our Building Dignity project. She was funded by a grant and pro bono services from Malum Architects. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let Jeff take you to that web page. Right, so there we have Building Dignity. And what she did was she took the themes of empower, secure, reconnect, parent, and harmonize, and applied it to each space in the shelter. So if we go to communal space, and I can't scroll down. Yeah, oh, there, thank you, Jeff. And maybe hit empower and see what it says. So you get the pictures, you get the quotes. This comes up with each one of these areas of shelter in terms of how empowerment, security, connection, reconnection, parenting, and just harmonizing can happen. Margaret was able to, I call it an intervention. We had one of our programs that had gotten a building, one of those federal surplus buildings, and it was huge. And they were going to make that into emergency shelter. And it was the least cozy type of building you could possibly imagine. And before they started implementing, they were still in the design stages. Margaret got to them with all of these different suggestions of how they could make it more private, more cozy, more pleasant. And so they gave up the idea that residents would be sharing rooms. And they even made some rooms large enough or had sliding doors so that big families, we have a lot of big families, immigrant families that really appreciate that. So they had the bathroom that was in each bedroom so that, again, people didn't have to share bathrooms. The kitchen, of course, is industrial. Everything is that sort of equipment, but they figured out a way where residents are able to maneuver independently, not have to share the kitchen or sign up for different shifts for meals. So they were able to completely redo what it was they had intended. And I think that's probably one of my favorite communal living shelters that I've seen. That has that connection without the idea of trying to get up into each other's business too much. And they are able to house men in that program. They often also house men in motels. They had one sort of prefab housing where they used for men. So they were really able to be inclusive. Be more responsive to the LGBTQ communities, including trans folks. So just also thinking about how do communal living spaces work for people in the LGBTQ community. Okay, I think we are ready to go back. And all I need to do is figure out how to reshare my screen again. There we go. I think I did it. Life is good. So as we leave the communal living shelter aspects, and for those of you who are perhaps rethinking, or perhaps you've already done some experimentation, maybe as you think about, what could you do instead, and you've really already tried some things out. it's the possibilities. What are they? And I did this little slide with the picture and the happy birthday with the idea of, instead of one big birthday cake that we're all sharing, and when we blow the candles out, we're spitting all over the cake, you know, all of those unhealthy things when sometimes you're sharing stuff. And here we've got just separate cupcakes. Everybody can have their own cupcake. And what could that be looking like as far as a celebration? So the possibilities, whether it's apartments, we have a beautiful, beautiful YWCA program in Pierce County that renovated an apartment building and made it pretty accessible. And so everybody in emergency shelter has their own individual apartments. There is some shared living space, but their apartments have kitchens. I mean, it's completely self-contained. And if somebody doesn't want to connect or visit with or share anything with anybody, that's their choice. Scattered site. When I finally got so tired at our communal living program, I just moved everybody out of that shelter and into scattered site apartments that were sprinkled throughout an apartment complex. Everybody had their own unit. We did have an office and a children's area on site so that people could come to the office. They did have groups for kids, and that went really well. There was that independence of everybody having their own unit. Hotel motels, renovate. There's a lot of hotels up for sale in Washington State. So there's money from the federal government to do emergency housing. And while I'm not sure I'd recommend a great big hotel for a program in DV survivors, there are certainly cute little motels here and there that could potentially be renovated. Another thing I did when I was working as a shelter housing director was to rent blocks in rooms. In our area, hotel space can be really difficult to find. I would always go for extended stay units and just rent them, and they were always full. And it was that backup place, or when we were still in communal living shelter, it was that place for survivors who I knew and they knew would not particularly appreciate a communal living situation. You know, there's also the possibility of those mom and pop safe home units. You know, we used to safe home a lot. When I joined this particular agency, it had a safe home program instead of an emergency shelter. And those were little units, kind of self-contained units that were in family homes. And they were willing to have survivors of domestic violence in that unit. And as long as they were able to provide a certain amount of respect and autonomy for those families, it could work really well. So what people often then ask related to not having that space is, what about the advocacy? What about the support? You know, one of the things I heard from somebody and during the course of our questions and answers was 24/7 staffing. There's always an advocate there. And, you know, I'm suggesting here that maybe we can rethink that in terms of staffing. We have a lot of little programs all throughout Washington State where they don't have shelter staff. They never did. It wasn't anything new and unusual. And there were certainly many that would have some staff during the day, but not at night. So the idea of maybe rethinking that and thinking of other ways that somebody could reach out in a crisis. Maybe it is that hotline number that your program probably operates. Just letting people know, reassuring them that there is somebody to talk to, but it's not necessarily down in the front office or right there on site. We would sometimes have minimal office space in owned buildings, but again, you know, it's the encouragement of, what about moving out of being tied to a facility? and having advocates out in the community with survivors. Oops. So we started thinking more about mobile advocacy, and I would say that this was kind of in the back of my head all the way back to Kentucky, because one of the things I did as a volunteer was to take survivors to different places, provide that transportation. And often, depending upon the state of my baby and whether I had her with me or whether she was with her dad, I would be able to advocate with them in court. I'm sure many of you do the legal advocacy and have court-based advocates, but court, the welfare office. Sometimes there were other places like housing. We would try and find housing. And so being in person and present for them was something I had already enjoyed. And when we were working in the Bellevue program, I encouraged advocates to do that and would often cover their shifts for them so they could get out and actually advocate with and for survivors. And, in context, it really is a part of our history. It is what DVSA volunteer advocates did prior to any facilities. My gosh, it was the era of carrying pages, especially in the sexual assault part of the world. But we all did that at one point in time at the very beginning. And it has continued in culturally specific communities, those communities that just really can't afford to have a shelter, or because of the outreach, it's so hard for people to come into you. And so the idea of going out to them, like the Promotor model, which is a culturally sensitive approach for the Latinx communities. And it's been used throughout the US, not only for domestic violence, but for healthcare. Natural helpers in the Bay Area and the King County Asian Pacific Islander communities. They don't necessarily have shelters. They don't expect people to come to them. They figure out where it is they can meet them. Where are the community centers? Where are perhaps it's faith communities, perhaps it is the health center. Where can we go to you? A library. So mobile advocacy isn't just about a car. And in a minute, I'm going to ask Jeff to pull up another web page, but I just want to kind of go through these little bullets as far as what it's like, again, to support somebody on the go, going with them to appointments, the tough ones. Sometimes housing appointments can be so belittling and demeaning for survivors, and just having someone by their side. And perhaps they might wish for you to say something, perhaps not. You could just be their quote unquote friend there, or they might even introduce you as an advocate. But just being able to have that person for tough times. That whole search, helping to fill out applications, being there for some of the inspections. Again, the nerves, and sometimes if there's a lot of kids running around, people don't always think of everything. Helping bridge a language barrier, such as with landlords. And that doesn't mean because they're speaking a different language, it's that whole legalese, it's that whole housing language that if it's something you are familiar with and you can support somebody, especially if they're an immigrant survivor, that can be so helpful. Meeting people where they are, the in-person advocacy, where they identify as a good place for them, as a safe place for them. And it might be a coffee shop. It might be in their home. It might be a workplace. Again, libraries, health centers. The most unique place I've ever met somebody or heard that they were being met was in a cemetery. That was a quiet, secluded place, and they felt safe there. Others had meetups in parks. And in terms of that whole advocacy and mobile advocacy, we have a number of advocates who don't have cars. So it isn't just about cars or needing to have a driver's license. We've got a whole group who live in the city and use transit, Uber, Lyft, and taxis. So I think I am going to stop sharing my screen and let Jeff share another web page that you all could certainly look at. And Jeff, if you could scroll down a little bit. So this is our first pillar of DV Housing First. And of course, it's built on survivor-driven, trauma-informed, and there's the mobile advocacy coming up there. Keep scrolling. And yeah, the review, there are the different questions about it. There's a whole toolkit that could certainly support in terms of thinking about what would you do if you as an advocate or your advocacy program weren't tied to a facility. So thanks, Jeff. And maybe as I'm getting back to this, are there questions or thoughts so far? Please enter comments, exclamation points, questions in the chat box. This is about the time where I'd be breaking everybody up into small group discussions.
And if you do have a question you'd like to verbalize it, go ahead and raise your hand. There's a button on the right-hand side on the bottom. It's a yellow hand. Click that button and I'd be happy to unmute you and let you do your thing.
It is seeming like there aren't questions at this point. Are there folks out there doing this already?
The question just came in, Linda, from
Okay.
Patty. Patty asks, do you have to follow landlord tenant laws when you use individual units?
Mm-hmm. When I rented, and it was a block of 12 apartments scattered throughout, and we were the person, we were the tenant. And while, you know, we have to uphold the different rules that a landlord might have, but in general, they would not screen. They knew exactly what it was being used for. They didn't know the identities of the people in the apartments. Our landlord tenant laws in Washington state have all of the protections for private landlords that you'll find in VAWA for HUD funded programs or HUD funded buildings. So while we respected the rules, like you don't smoke, and just the basic guidelines of the apartment facility, their expectations, and we didn't screen. I know that's a big thing, and we didn't screen in the way that a private landlord might. We certainly probably had people who had been incarcerated. You know, so many of our survivors have experienced incarceration, have either victim defendants or have used criminal behavior just for survival. So we didn't screen for things like that or past drug use, none of that. So I hope that was getting to what the question was. There was a strong enough relationship with the landlords, and we did everything we could to make sure that stayed that way.
Linda, there were two more questions. Would you prefer me to read them?
Sure.
Okay. The second question, can you share how you deal with strict confidentiality regulations in public spaces, such as coffee shops?
Mhm.
I love the idea of mobile advocacy, but I'm always worried about confidentiality risks.
Right. I've actually got a whole little segment on safety, which includes that privacy and confidentiality. Um, and I think, of course, in larger communities, it's a little bit easier. But, in rural communities, everybody knows everybody anyway. And so it's a matter of being in contact with that survivor in terms of what it is they're comfortable with, what it is they're comfortable with in calling you, referencing who you are. You might be a new friend if they run into somebody they know. Of course, if everybody in town knows that you're a DV advocate, that could be a good thing or maybe a not so good thing. But there's a whole part of the community engagement that calls out every single one of us are part of a community. And of course, survivors are too. And sometimes we're part of that same community. We certainly experience that when we work with tribal programs and Native survivors and their advocates on the reservation, as well as farm worker communities where everybody knows everyone. And, just one of my personal favorite stories is a woman that came into the shelter back in Kentucky with her little boy. I actually knew her because her son and my son played on the same little soccer team that my husband coached. And so there we were pretty much every Saturday, figuring out how we were going to be with each other when her abusive partner was, of course, at that soccer game. So, you talk things through, you figure out how can we negotiate this? How can we be respectful of someone's confidentiality and listen to what the survivor is directing and saying? And maybe that survivor doesn't want to be out in the community at all. It goes back to this is their confidentiality, their autonomy, their journey. And if they have absolutely no place in the community that they would want to meet you and they want to come to your office, by all means. So that was probably a long answer. And I might not go into it in much detail then when we get to that slide, but I know what burning questions are like, and it's hard to think about anything else when you've got that going on.
There were a few more, Linda, that came through.
Okay.
Okay. Two that are similar to maybe when services end or are terminated with the survivor. How do you go about having them leave or move out? This was a follow-up to the first question regarding the tenant landlord.
Oh, okay.
And then the second question related to this was, what about eviction issues? How do you address these?
So asking people to leave from shelter is never easy. And it's not easy whether it's communal living, and it's not easy if we needed to do that in an apartment unit. I know that we had never gone through, and other programs have had to, gone through the messy eviction process where someone has refused to leave. But ultimately, there has been a process that I believe has been respectful and has really worked to find a better alternative for a survivor, whether it was communal living shelter or whether it was one of the apartments. I know that we have segued people out of something that was our shelter unit into a temporary hotel room, motel room, something different with stricter parameters, because you usually have a manager that's keeping an eye on what you're doing, no matter who you are, and asking them to work with us in a way that we could help them with the next step for housing. And unfortunately, it might be another emergency shelter unit. It might be a better fit with another program. But I don't think the eviction process is ever pleasant or ever easy.
Thank you, Linda. And it's similarly related. was a question about to the first question with the landlord, when you all were owning the units, there's an assumption that you are responsible and liable for any damages or other issues that arise within these units?
Yep. I think that's part, and we'll bring it up at the end. And I'm just realizing that I don't have that much time left. I was worried that there'd be too much time, but that's just one of the things that has to be a part of your budget.
And maybe we'll save that. Then there was a last question was, can you talk a little more about not having 24/7 advocates? How will this work? I don't know if that's later in your presentation, or if you'd like to address that now.
You know, we can talk a little bit about it now, but it's just a matter of, you know, and I'll just be blunt, most of them, pretty much all of them, are adults. You know, there isn't a sense that adults, whether they're in their own homes or maybe they're in other community settings, I would hope that we respect each survivor in a way that they can negotiate, that they can live, that they can survive, they can thrive. And ultimately, if they have a trauma trigger, ultimately, if there is one of those instances where they need to talk to somebody, just as if they were in a home, in their own home, they would be able to reach out to you through that hotline. So it goes back to then, how is your shelter set up? The little communal living shelters that our rural programs operated, people could come and go. They had different, not so much keys, but I don't know all of the fancy technology, but they were able to card their way in and out. They had their rooms, they had the expectation of what it looked like, and they generally treated the properties pretty nicely. You know, there was a certain amount of pride in that. And when the advocate would come, there's one program that it was 2 fourplexes that was their shelter, and there was nothing on site in terms of an office. And the advocate would come every day and check in, and what did they need? Was there anything? Did they need advocacy to get somewhere? So that worked well, and there was a fair amount, again, of independence and autonomy. And this was actually in a little rural program. So I'm going to keep moving, if that's okay. If I can wake things up again and do that. And so I've just got a little bit of a list of why this works, where appointments can be difficult. And, you know, I don't know about you, but we've had many appointments where there were no shows when we were waiting for people to show up at a facility or a meeting place. Sometimes it's helpful to enter into that survivor's world. There's a little bit better understanding. And it also breaks social isolation for a survivor. And when you're in the community, it improves your own collaborations and partnerships with those entities, those other organizations you're working with. So can happen anywhere. I like the last bullet, and I just really have to give credit to Chris Billhart, a colleague of mine who developed this particular piece. She's now at National Alliance for Safe Housing, but we worked together for many years when she was in Portland, Oregon, and just spoke to the difference when they moved from their communal living shelter and then to advocates in the community with housing, and just the connection and the fluidity, and how advocates were moving in community instead of hidden away. These are just a list of considerations if you want to think about mobile services, and I imagine these slides will be available, and that website that Jeff has already brought up. Our toolkit is certainly there. But, it's going back to what does your community look like? And if there wasn't a facility and if you were doing something community-based, what sort of approach, where might it be? What would be helpful? And think about not only resources and geographic distances, but what is the composition? Who all is there? Who are you serving now in your communal living program? Who aren't you serving? Who aren't you reaching? Who won't come to you? And then, of course, program considerations. This is the safety planning thing and just how key it is. It will always be really important. We know that there are many abusive people out there who have caused harm and would do whatever they can to continue causing harm. And so it's important to just really communicate with that survivor and have that rapport, have that mutual respect, and for you all to have a language where you have your cues in terms of what needs to happen in different situations, and to let your program know what your schedule is. Check in before and after you visit with somebody. Follow your instincts and always make sure your cell phones are charged and handy. And again, I just want to highlight our rural programs in particular, because this is a tougher one, I think, for rural programs. I think in urban programs, you can, depending upon where you are, kind of get lost. You can take different roads, you can go different places, you can meet up all over the place. And it's a little easy to stay anonymous. But in rural programs where everybody knows everyone, and sometimes the culturally specific programs, I'm thinking of the ones that we have in our own international district, Chinatown, where people know who you are. And there's a beautiful story that comes out of one of our farm worker communities, where the advocates are all from that community. They are all former farm workers, are familiar with the environment and the culture. And the community generally knows. They have historic memory of survivors and perhaps that they have run into difficulties or probably not been the best or most reputable people in their community. And what these survivors pretty much experienced, and what the advocates said, is when the community sees us walking next to somebody, when the community sees us expressing support and belief in someone, the community says, we know that they're doing better. I heard something very similar from our tribal program, that when the advocate on one particular reservation took a survivor and walked with her, that there was the same message of, oh, good, things are better. And the invitations to that survivor to come back to different community events and to people's homes. So it's, again, remembering the humanity of them and who we all are. A frequent question is, what's the most cost effective? And I think Jeff mentioned that to me at one point in time when we were communicating early on. And, I know it's a big question. Funders really want to know. And of course, those of us who operate programs really want to know. And, I think it could easily be a draw if you do it right. You've got potentially facilities that you own. And of course, you have to maintain and operate them. Maybe you're making payments on them. Maybe you're doing the loan forgiveness that so many programs have, state and federal programs have. But, that's a constant expenditure. Or maybe you're renting units. Well, there's an investment there. I think I already mentioned that if you are going to rent apartments to use as emergency shelter, or if you are going to take out a block of hotel units, certainly the hotel should should clean on a daily basis just as they would for anybody else. But there is a certain amount of liability in terms of damage. And so you need to be prepared for that. Just kind of think of it as a given that something might go wrong. Who knows what that might be? And you might need to make it right. You know, I remember early on, just in terms of placing somebody in a hotel, and this poor kid, I felt so sorry for him. He was an older boy, but he wet the bed, and that motel operator just came unglued, was so upset. And it was a matter of, that's okay. We'll replace the mattress. We'll clean the room. We'll make sure it gets cleaned. It's all right. You know, when you're dealing with human beings, you have to be prepared for that and make the appropriate budget accommodations. And whether you're renting, whether you're owning, no matter what you're doing, you've got to be advocates. And there's an advocacy investment in either one. You know, there was often the expectation that, oh gosh, we don't have 24/7 shelter. We don't have to worry about paying a midnight shift worker. Well, I wouldn't say that. I would just move that midnight shift worker into a place of mobile advocacy, because it takes time, it takes investment, and advocacy can last for quite a while. You know, it really depends again upon your breadth and how long you support survivors. What do you support them to? Where are you going? I know that right now we have what we call bridge housing, and it's 6 month, up to 6 month emergency shelter. And all of the advocates that are attached to that facility are mobile, and they support people throughout that facility and then beyond, usually for a couple of months, and usually working very hard at the community engagement part, so that people are going into a community where they've already been connected to, or perhaps the bridge is built so that they can reestablish social network. So it's what makes sense in your community. And it looks like I have about 4 minutes. I would also do just a little infomercial that tomorrow I'm doing a workshop on domestic violence housing first, which kind of takes this whole concept of what do you do either in place of or after sheltering. So if any of you are interested, I hope to see you there. Otherwise, is there a final question or two that I can answer in 4 minutes?
There are no more questions in the chat as of yet. Linda, you addressed them all, so thank you. I just did place, and this is from the LE law enforcement CEUs. There's a survey for the session, so we would appreciate your thoughts and time and sharing anything. But thank you, Linda, for sharing your email address. There is a question that came through. It says, some of our clients we work with don't have access to a phone. How do we ensure these clients receive services?
Give them a phone. I'm sorry, that was curt, and that was just a real quick reflex, but I'm not sure what your policies or history might be, but something that programs have done, sometimes subsidized by lovely phone companies and otherwise not, using flexible financial assistance, is making sure that a survivor has a phone and a certain amount of phone service. Or I know there are all sorts of little phones out there that, you know, that you can, I don't know all of the minute adding possibilities. I'm not very tech savvy, but there's a wide variety of things that programs do to make sure survivors have communication, have that phone, and that it's subsidized for a period of time.
Thank you, Linda. And another participant shared the quote, "We've bought them throwaway phones." So I'm assuming those disposable phones with just no minutes, as you were mentioning. So Thank
Yeah, well, sometimes that, but then also always a certain number of minutes so that they've got something to start with. And if I were there, I'd be looking for your ideas and what you've been doing. I really didn't give you much time for that. Something to reflect on and take back to your programs and discuss.
Thank you, Linda.
All right. Well, thank you, Jeff, and thank you, everybody. My information is up there. Please don't hesitate to email me, and I always get back to people at some point in time, and it's been good being here. Thank you so much.